You're listening to Salford City Radio, 94.4 FM, the Friday Sports Show, with your host, Jimmy Petruzzi. Bringing you news from our local area, around Salford and around the world. We aim to increase participation of sport, awareness of sport, but we also have a segment we introduce some of the world's most influential people in the field of psychology and related fields who give us an insight into their work. We've been very fortunate this show to use some of the world's best athletes, sports people, coaches, trainers, footballers, you name it. They've given us fascinating insights into the show. We try and bring the world to Salford to the world as well, with perspectives from different places around the world too. Today, I have a very fascinating guest. She's director of broadband performance, and also just released a book, Sportsperson's Guide to Thrive, Mental Health and Wellbeing. It's really, really fascinating. Obviously, it's a topic that's very, very close to our heart on the show as well. And we've got, someone who's really, really credible, an expert in the field, who's going to give you a really interesting insight into the world of sport, and also, a number of areas, really, such a massive area. So I'm sure, if you sit back and enjoy the rest of the show. Sarah, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Thank you. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Okay, so just for the listeners, Sarah, where did it all begin for yourself? How did you get into doing what you do? You have such a fascinating background. I don't think I'll do you justice with the intro, but a bit of an insight to the audience in terms of how you got into what you do and where you are now.
Yeah, so I've always been interested in people and what makes us tick and what makes us behave the way that we do and feel the way that we do. And so I studied psychology at Manchester University, so just down the road from you, and wasn't really sure what to do with that afterwards. So I ended up doing a master's in business psychology, and then had a bit of a career in business psychology, which I still do as well as sport. But sport is my real passion. So in 2009, I was lucky enough to meet Professor Steve Peters. Oh, okay. So he wrote the Shrimp Paradox. He was working with the British cycling team at the time, and also working with the Great Britain Taekwondo team. And he offered me a job, which I was like, that's amazing. I've not worked in sport before, but he was my mentor. Really supported me, helped me through that journey. So I worked with the Taekwondo team for over 10 years. I was really lucky to support them at London Olympics and Rio. Mm-hmm. So yeah, amazing experience. Great group of people to work with.
Absolutely, that sort of really, sort of paints the picture for the audience in terms of. I think that there's not a week that goes by I don't hear a conversation about the Shrimp Paradox. Yeah. Someone mentioning it somewhere. And what a mentor to have. I mean, what was it like to sort of to have Steve? That must have been really, really fascinating for yourself. I mean, wow.
Oh yeah. I mean, he's a psychiatrist, so
yeah. So I was thinking, yeah.
Yeah, he comes at it maybe from a different point of view to some sports psychologists, not all, but I think he brought that psychiatry element in, looking at people's whole life and what was going on inside your head. So it just really helped me to understand how people work. And if you're a sports person, you're still a human. It's just you're in that environment, and what is it about that environment that's difficult, and how can we help people thrive in it, which hence the title of the book.
No, it's really interesting, and it's interesting how sort of your background sort of takes shape as well. Sarah, the sort of business psychology, the psychology, obviously, the influence of Steve Peters. And the book itself, I mean, like, for the audience, and I think it's really, fascinating how you sort of put this book together, really. How would you describe the sort of book? I mean, what would you sort of, obviously, sports people we know have challenges, not just in sport, but outside sport as well. I think one of the most difficult things for me in sport is that sort of fine line between, maybe it could be a clinical issue, is it performance based, and obviously it's come a long way, psychology and working with people in sport. But give us an overview of what sort of the book is about. What message were you aiming to get across to the reader?
Well, the first chapter does discuss what you've just talked about, really. So it's the questions that I ask or pose at the start of the chapter. What does it mean to be mentally healthy, and how does that link to performance? So if you're mentally well, you're thriving, how does that help your performance? What might you experience if you have poor mental health, and what are the different causes, and what's the best way to talk about mental health. So what I found is there's lots of debates, lots of different viewpoints that you can come at this from. But I think if you can understand all the different aspects of it and find one that you can relate to, then it'll help you understand what you're experiencing, and also help you figure out what being mentally healthy or thriving looks like for you. And it doesn't mean that we're happy all the time. It means that we will experience a wide range of emotions, and that there's a number of dimensions, a number of pieces of the puzzle, whether you're in sport or in a business environment, that contribute to that feeling of mental health and well-being. And that's what I talk through in each of the chapters. So each chapter is a piece of the puzzle, I would say.
No, absolutely, and it's really interesting. It's sort of like, something sort of comes to mind there in terms of like your experience, and sort of, I think it's really fascinating how the experience and how you got to where you are and the work you do. And would you say, I mean, on the subject of mental health, I think obviously the last few years it's been a strange few years. It feels like sometimes it's almost like we had the COVID pandemic and everything that everyone experienced through that, and now things have been as normal can be for a bit. But did you find when you were sort of writing the book, or your thoughts for the book, in terms of did you reflect on that? Did that sort of change any of the work that you do, Sarah? The sort of who could have forecast the events of the last few years type thing, or how did that?
Yeah, I think it just reinforced some of the things that I was writing about, particularly in the relationships chapter, because we didn't have that social support, that network that we normally would. Like, we couldn't see people as much. So I think it just reminded us for lots of us, how important that is, and having a routine or having other challenges that we can do. So a lot of things that contribute to our mental health were not there, were taken away. Added in the fear and uncertainty, could be around your job or around your health, of people you love, or your own health. So it's it's understandable that a lot of us did struggle during that period, because all of these pieces of the jigsaw were impacted.
Absolutely, and like, what sort of like challenges do you highlight in the book in terms of like for a performer, and what can say someone who doesn't perform in sport? I mean, what can they take away from the book? For example, if you've got someone sort of reading and they may not be a performer at the highest level, but generally speaking, they might sort of think, well, I could sort of get some insights here. Can you give us sort of an insight into what your thoughts around that are? Yeah,
so I think whatever level of sport you take part in, I think a lot of people can relate to maybe feeling nervous, or that feeling of fear or anxiety, putting a lot of pressure on yourself to perform well, or feeling like you might be letting people down if you're in a team sport. So there's a whole chapter dedicated to stress, fear and anxiety, so some practical tips of how you might deal with that. We also talk about whether you focus on the outcome or the process. So if you just think, I have to win, my whole identity is tied up with winning, I'm a failure as a person if I don't perform well, then that's going to contribute to you feeling worried as well. So we look at how you can separate your identity so you can be valuable as a person and separate it away from your sporting results. So you can still care about the outcome, try really hard, but it's not the end of the world if you don't. And it's about dealing with disappointment, dealing with setbacks. It's trying to find that balance and perspective that allows you to perform at your best without it impacting on your mental health.
Absolutely. And what are some of the things that sort of like your thoughts in terms of like, a sports person can do? I mean, you mentioned there obviously some strategies around anxiety, performance anxiety as well, and just generally like in terms of like your work, sort of maybe reflecting on your work, and you've obviously worked with some world-class athletes over the years, and what are some things that you sort of feel that work well with that? I know there's no two people the same, but generally speaking, are there sort of, is there anything specific that sort of you felt that athletes really valued and got a lot out of?
Yeah, I think it comes back to that outcome process thing. So you get people to sit down and and write a list of all the things that will contribute. So, say you've got a big event coming up, or you want to do your best over the season. You write down all the things that might contribute to it. So it could be getting your nutrition right, you're doing your weight, but it is probably things like, am I happy at home? So if my relationships aren't great, then I'm not going to feel happy, then I might not sleep, and then that'll affect me in my sport, it'll affect me in my life. So trying to work on all the different things, so having a list of all the things that could contribute, and it is often not just about the physical training you do, it's about that broader aspect of your life.
No, it's interesting, and in the world of like athletics, in the world of like Olympic sports as well, and you mentioned sort of Taekwondo there. I mean, obviously, psychology has been a big part of sport. We're seeing now like the tip of the iceberg in football. In years gone by, it wasn't sort of fashionable to have sports psychology or anything around that area, but now sort of we've seen some sort of high profile footballers come out and talk about their psychology, how important a role it's been. What are your thoughts on the sort of football world, Sarah, in terms of do you think that they will embrace psychology in terms of like going forward? I mean, what are your sort of thoughts?
I think, as you said, it's becoming more acceptable, and it's not seen as a weakness. So you would go to the gym, you get your strength and conditioning coach, you might have a nutritionist. So it's the same with your mind. Not saying go and see a psychologist when you've got a problem. It's saying, how can I maximise it? How can I get the best out of myself? How can I switch off at night and be present with my family? How can I visualise? Like there's a whole myriad of things that you can do. So it's not just there for someone that's struggling. That you can do. So if you think of it like you're exercising your mind exactly the same way you would your body, and it just often means you enjoy it more as well. And then you can have a longer career because you're enjoying it and you're not feeling burnt out and fed up with it.
Absolutely. So absolutely, it's really interesting because I find that like you've mentioned there, sometimes it's like an ongoing thing and sort of figuring out what works for you. And I mean, I tend to get the impression sometimes in some sports, and particularly football at times, that and I know it's changed a lot, and this a generalisation, but just from my own experience, it's almost like, well, we'll speak to someone once and that's it. But you wouldn't do that with physical training. You've got to keep training physically. And so I was telling them, you've got to keep training mentally, because life the way it is, you're going to have adversities, things are going to come up, and not even if you do, just keep your mind as strong as you can. What's your sort of take on sort of like developing maybe like a program, like say a physical program, but sort of mental skills and sort of keep working on yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not I've done it once and it's sorted. So there's definitely that ongoing individual work, but particularly if you're a part of a team, again, I write a whole chapter on the importance of culture, and it's the same in business. Like you probably know yourself, in some environments, in some cultures, you thrive and you really feel your best and comfortable and confident, and you just want to go and try things. And in other environments, you just feel the opposite, and it really can squash you down and make you feel not great about yourself. So it's not just as a psychologist working with an individual, it's looking at the whole team and what's the ethos, like what's the behaviours that we encourage, and how do we talk to each other, and how do we approach games. Like, all of that is critical as well, because it'll influence how you feel and how you manage your mind.
Absolutely. And like any coaches, we have coaches that listen to the program, and many coaches of different levels. Some obviously coach at the highest level, some amateur recreationally, or even teachers, for example. And they might be thinking, the book sounds great, and in terms of possibly, they may be able to implement some things that you mentioned in the book. But I mean, how do you feel a coach would benefit from sort of reading the book? I mean, you mentioned I've sort of got a few light bulb moments there, thinking, okay, well, perhaps I can sort of like, we always cherry picking ideas type thing. But how do you feel for, say, the coach who sort of just doesn't have any experience in sort of the field of psychology and just wants to sort of learn some processes that may be able to sort of help him or her or athletes?
I think it will be helpful for a number of reasons. I actually interviewed a few coaches as well as part of the book. So probably my most enjoyable bit of writing the book was interviewing lots of different people. So I interviewed a canoeing coach, an athletics coach. So a number of different coaches have fed in as well. So if you're a coach, you would get some of their insights, but also the chapter on creating a culture, I think, would be really, really helpful. There's a chapter on understanding yourself, so that could be the coach understanding themselves, also thinking, oh, that's how I could get to know my players a bit better, or the people I coach.
Definitely. No, that's really interesting. And so, like, obviously from a coaching perspective, in terms of the coaches themselves, I think sometimes what happens is the almost like the coaching staff kind of forget to work on themselves as well. And do you find yourself sort of working with coaches as well as a team as well at times?
Yeah, definitely. And I interviewed quite a few people that were athletes and then became coaches, and then they're like, oh, I really appreciate now how hard it is to be a coach. It is, and it's a big responsibility. Like particularly a coach of younger people. Yeah, you are creating and shaping them. So it can be a tough job, but they're the ones that feel the pressure because they want good outcomes for the team, but you're not actually the person in there doing it, so it's hard. Like you see them watching games and you think that's hard because you can't, you only have so much influence. And
absolutely. No, it's really interesting. What I find interesting, I suppose, from my perspective, a question that sort of, I'm sure the audience will sort of, no doubt will find value. But I'm just curious in my own mind in terms of, obviously Steve Peters, and I've read the book before as well, and I found that really interesting because it's a little bit different to what I've read before in that area, and I suppose, sort of making sense of it. And it's one of them really where it's kind of like, really, really interesting in terms of like the way the mind works. I think it's an easy way for people to understand the mind to a certain extent in terms of how they can manage the emotion and the thought process. And how much of an influence, Sarah, did that have on you in the book itself? Because I'm sort of sensing that you're your own person, albeit you've had mentors and mentor, but it's kind of like how much influence was that on you in the book and the work you do from a practical perspective?
Yeah, I worked with Steve for a long time, so he's obviously had a really big influence. And on the chapter on understanding yourself, so I talk about a little bit about how the brain works, and I talk about a couple of different models. So, Steve's model and there's other models. They're just, like you said, they're helpful ways to simplify something that's really complicated. Yeah. Like the brain, like we don't fully understand it. We're always doing new things about it. It's the most complicated part of our body. But if we can simplify it down and provide this framework, it just makes things so much easier, and you can help people to then apply it to themselves and say, oh well, that when I'm in that situation, might be that part of the brain that's thinking this, or this is how I'm it just makes it more user friendly.
Definitely, and it's interesting, really. I mean, it's kind of like, I find that really fascinating because obviously, we see kind of analogies and metaphors, and one of the ones being, and I must admit I hold my hands up for using it myself, like computer program. And obviously the brain's far more complex than the computer program. But sometimes it's just trying to get the message across, going forward. But then what happens, I find, is that it can get distorted as well in terms of the information, and then people have this perception that from the original perspective you want to put out there, kind of does the rounds and changes considerably. I suppose, in a simple way, it's not easy to get across. What would you say in terms of, like, from a psychological point of view, are there sort of themes that athletes do have? Are there sort of recurring themes? I mean, how would you describe, obviously emotions being a big thing for athletes as well, how they manage that, but what would you think for yourself in terms of what are some of the biggest challenges that you found that athletes have had presented to you, Sarah, and asked for help with?
I think a lot of it is that feeling that pressure to perform, and constantly feeling that. And for a lot of people, if it's your full-time career, that your livelihood depends on it. Yes, even if you're just playing, even if you're it's not your full-time job, like you can still feel that that pressure. And a lot of it again comes back to how your mind works. That your brain is there to help you survive. And a big part for us as social beings is that perception of how we are fitting into a group or what other people think about us. So it makes sense that there's always part of us thinking, how am I being seen? Am I good enough? What do people think about me? What if I let people down? Like, those are the kind of themes that would come out with athletes, and they'd often feel, they're putting the pressure on themselves. But if you dug a little deeper, it's actually, I don't want to let someone else down, or that they expect me to perform at this level. Like, I got a medal last time, I'm now expected to. So when they win the medal, they feel relief rather than satisfaction or joy, which is a real shame. So part of it is helping them to see it as a challenge and enjoying it rather than this big threat and fear, and which just makes it really unenjoyable.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting in terms of your own inspiration to write the book. I mean, something I didn't ask earlier that I was sort of meaning to ask. What sort of inspired you, Sarah, to sort of write this book? Obviously, it takes time to write a book and a lot of effort and energy. And what was your sort of main inspiration? I'm going to get something out there.
It was because I think the people that I work with at the more elite professional level, they get access to a lot of support and a lot of these ideas that maybe other people don't. And I just thought, I just wanted to collect it all in one place and be able to share it with people that might not normally have access to it. And I also love writing, so that was a bonus as well.
No, absolutely, and for sure anyone sort of listening in, and I think that's great. Obviously someone with your experience and insights can sort of, that's the great thing about, be able to get a book where, you wouldn't necessarily be able to sort of, it's not easy to work with people, obviously, in terms of the recreational athlete time and amongst other things, really, but to have that and to have something to sort of, work with for sure. And in terms of yourself, your own sort of vision going forward, is it more of the same in terms of the work you do? I mean, is there anything you can sort of share with our listeners in terms of what you have in the pipeline for yourself, or where do you feel your career will go? A bit deep, isn't it? But,
I really, really like the mix that I've got at the moment. I love working with athletes, like young athletes, more experienced, all a broad spectrum of different sports. I just think that's brilliant. But I also love the business side as well, and going into different businesses and learning about their unique culture. So I think I like variety. So
absolutely,
as long as it's something that I feel like I'm learning's really important to me. So it's learning and challenging myself.
And if anyone listening is sort of considering maybe going into sport, and we have a lot of people that listen in that have studied some form of psychology and perhaps are thinking they want to go down the road of sport. I mean, I find it really fascinating, your sort of background in terms of the entry into psychology, and sort of I think that I'm obviously very passionate about psychology. It's been a very transferable skill and a great skill to have across any area. But if anyone's sort of listening in is thinking, okay, well, perhaps I'd like to maybe go into sport, what I know it's hard to give advice, but what could you suggest that they take into consideration based on your own experiences, sort of moving into the world of sport?
Yeah, so my experience of getting to it isn't, like you said, a traditional one, but I think having worked in other places really helped before. So
absolutely.
Having worked in other businesses, or you can take ideas that you learn from one place to another. So I don't think you always have to go down the traditional route. And what I found, that's how I got to work with Taekwondo and work with Steve, is you just have to ask sometimes. Like, you just have to be a bit brave sometimes and just contact someone and say, can I have a chat, or can I come and watch you do something? And they might say no, but then they might say yes. And because someone helped me, I want to then help someone else. So if you ask, you don't know until you ask.
Absolutely. And for yourself, Sarah, so, if you do have any highlights that you could share in terms of your own sort of career up to this point now, is it like reflecting back on the work that you've done, and is there anything that sort of comes to mind? Yeah.
I mean, there's the obvious big ones about being at an Olympic Games and watching someone win their medal and how much it means to them, and knowing how much they put into it, and knowing how much as a team we put in. And Latela Mohammed stands out for me at Rio, because he had really struggled with injuries in the lead up to it. At one point, thought, is he even going to get there? And then he ended up winning a silver medal, and he just never ever gave up. And as a team, we never gave up. And we had some meetings where we was like, oh, there's another step back and another setback. And so it always reminds me that you just can't give up, because you never know. Like, you just have to keep going with it. So that Jade winning her gold medal in London as a teenager, just amazing. Like, just, she didn't expect it, we didn't expect it. She just went for it.
Absolutely, No, I watched that on TV, to be fair, and it's amazing, really, in terms of, like, I thought London was amazing for GB, because it was a massive turnaround, obviously, in terms of, like, you know, and they've maintained it, really, which is sort of amazing in terms of, like, you know, I think that Great Britain punches above their weight in terms of, like, the medal haul at the moment. It's just phenomenal. But and I suppose that sort of goes down to a number of variables, but certainly, like, getting people like yourself on board is a big impact, I would think, to sort of work with athletes, sort of just, you know, obviously as that layer, you know, in terms of, like, I mean, the psychological part of any sport is huge, really. I think in some sports it's probably not, you know, I wouldn't say it's underplayed, but I don't think that, you know, they recognise just how important a variable it is. If your mind's not in the right place, then you're going to not maximise your chances. That's for sure, to win anything, really. And in terms of the book itself, if people want to purchase the book, Sarah, is anywhere they can sort of go, and sort of where can I direct people to go if they want to get a copy of the book?
So Amazon. So it's as you said, called Perform and Thrive. My name's Sarah Broadhead. If you look on Amazon, you'll find it on there. I think it's on in Waterstones, online Waterstones as well. So they're the best places to get it.
Fantastic. So they can just, you know, get on the Amazon if it's easy enough for them, and sort of, you know, get a copy. In terms of, like, maybe finding more about your work, Sarah, where can they go in terms of, like, you know, do you have a website, anything like that maybe we can sort of direct people towards? Yeah. So
Broadhead Performance is my website. I'm also on Instagram, so Sarah B Psych on Instagram. There's also a link to my book on there as well. But yeah, I'd love to hear from people. I'd love to people to get in contact. That'd be brilliant.
Fantastic, and that's a sort of great way to connect. That's one of the great things about social media, to connect that way. Fantastic. But no, it's been really fascinating. I'm sure I could definitely sort of carry on the conversation, but I'm mindful of time. It's been fascinating for me and the listeners. I've really got a lot out of it, for sure. So we wish you all the best with the book, that's for sure, and your career as you keep going. So very kind of you to join us. That was Sarah Broadhead of Broadhead Performance. We talked about the book amongst other things as well. So, you know, do reach out, have a look at the book, that's for sure. Perform and Thrive, a sportsperson guide to mental health and well-being. You know, definitely check it out if you can do. This is Salford City Radio, the Friday Sports Show on 94.4 FM. Your host, Jimmy Petruzzi, news from the world area and the world, and we aim to increase awareness and participation of sport.